Right. So welcome everyone to the next in this series of Reformation Conversations brought to you by the Meter Center for Calvin Studies. My name is Karine Mogg and I am the director of the Meter Center. It's my delight to welcome you here today. Today we're having the great pleasure of hearing from Christopher Ocker about his recent book published in the fall. It's called Hybrid Reformation, A Social, Cultural, and Intellectual History of Contending Forces, published by Cambridge University Press in the fall of 2022. Christopher Ocker is Assistant Provost at the Graduate School of Theology and Interim Dean of San Francisco Theological Seminary at the University of Redlands in California. He also holds a title of Professor of Medieval and Early Modern Studies at Australian Catholic University. He is currently leading a multi-partner project titled Religious Mobilities, Europe and the Medieval and Early Modern World. He is also a project member in another big group called Recognizing Religions, the Cultural Dynamics of Religious Encounters and Interactions in Historical Perspective. He obtained his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1991. He is the author of numerous works, including Luther, Conflict and Christendom, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, Church Robbers and Reformers in Germany. I'm sort of cutting out the long title, but anyhow, Church Robbers and Reformers in Germany, Leiden, 2006, and Biblical Poetics Before Humanism and Reformation, also published by Cambridge in 2002. But today he's going to be introducing us, as I said, to his most recent book, Hybrid Reformation. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Oh gosh, okay. I'll just, Karen, I'll just say a few words about it and then answer questions. Is that how we
That's absolutely fine. Yep.
Okay. So, I published this book that you mentioned, Luther, Conflict and Christendom, in 2018, and I tried to take a fresh look at the Luther controversy as a conflict, and tried to find some organic forces at play in giving that conflict shape and moving away from a kind of personal interpretation that was focused on questions of Luther and Luther's influence. And one of the things that I couldn't really do in that book is think about the Reformation as it was intended to be, and as it affected people on the edges of the Reformation debate. And so I thought one way to approach that, and drawing together some things that I had done in the past, would be to focus on those who were affected by the Reformation without really intending to be. And that's really the first two chapters of the book. And then also the protagonists of reform and how we might think of them without necessarily being beholden to their own view of themselves, to what they thought they were doing in society. And I thought one way to describe that is to think of third forces. If we take the forces of confessionalization, essentially Protestant and Catholic confessionalization as force one and force two, we could look at everything that doesn't quite fit that category, but is related to the religious controversy as a third force. And so that would include in one frame both those who tried to resist and couldn't resist the polarizing force of confessional debate, and those who promoted confessional debate and may have been pushed to compromise some of their principles along the way. And of course, there are a lot of different ways of thinking of how they might have compromised those principles. Even though most of the people we're talking about there, people like Luther and Calvin and all the principal reformers, were really, I think, remarkably consistent in how they presented themselves. And that, excuse me, I think also gives us an opportunity to rethink how the late medieval background might relate to the Reformation. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. There's a lot more to be said about those specifics.
So if I start then just by reflecting on the kind of genre or the trend in which you see your study. I mean, there's different takes on the Reformation, right? There's the straight theological account, the doctrinal account, the intellectual history, the social history. How would you see yours? Like, if you had to categorize what kind of an approach you take, how would you describe your approach? I think it is fascinating.
Well, yeah, I think the word that I would probably feel most comfortable with is to call it a cultural history. And I think the term cultural, in the way I'm using it, embraces both the social historical and the more abstract dimensions of that, what people think they experience, what they feel, and as well as formal intellectual life. I think, though, in both cases, as we do as historians, it's really important to contextualize both activities, both intellectual activity and then, people in everyday life and where they intersect with religion. So in the case of theology, which I think is a marvelously fascinating intellectual enterprise, in the case of theology, it's really important to put it in the context of schools. And schools and careers, the careers of the people who are producing it. And often they are teachers, but not only teachers, they're often also, since earlier than the 14th century, they're also advisors, particularly court advisors, and they're entangled with interests that, in the broadest sense of the word, can have to be described as political and not, defined by themselves. So, yeah, that's that. When I think of a cultural history, I think of it as something that is trying to embrace both of those things at once.
Which is a really challenging assignment, and impressive that you managed to bring them together, because still I think in the field there's much more of either a social historical approach or perhaps intellectual / theological approach to the study of the Reformation. So bringing them together, I think, is an ambitious project. Your starting point in the book is really with Anabaptism. Can you say a little more about how you wove that particular strand of the Reformation in to your study of the Hybrid Reformation?
Well, thanks. There's something I learned from Ellen Yahtzee-Gleep, who's on this Zoom call, in her dissertation, which she wrote at Berkeley for Tom Brady, and she looked very closely at the prosecutions of Anabaptists or people accused of Anabaptism, particularly in Hesse in the 1530s. One of the things that comes out there is, most of these people, they just look like ordinary people. And she used a phrase to characterize their religiosity. She called it an embrace of extreme piety. And I think that's the one thing we can really identify among all Anabaptists, whether they clearly belong to a specific group of rebaptizers or not. And as you know from the polemical literature of the Reformation, all kinds of people get put under that label. And of course, they get put under that label on both the Protestant and the Catholic sides. That's a product of the 1527 imperial condemnation of Anabaptism. So everybody wants to make sure they're not an Anabaptist. Anyone with an official position wants to make sure that it's clear that they're not an Anabaptist. So I think if we think about Anabaptism as something that actually is closer to how ordinary people encounter the messages of religious reform, I think we can learn a lot. And that's exactly opposite the way a confessional paradigm thinks of Anabaptism. And of course, as everyone on this call knows, as professional church historians have often depicted Anabaptism, that's an extreme group, small and peripheral. And what I'm suggesting is, well, what if you take seriously the point that Ellen made, if you take that seriously, then you can actually think of Anabaptism as representative of the majority of people, far closer to where we might expect ordinary people without a professional commitment to one or another side of the Reformation debate, where they might have been.
Absolutely. And I think that really sort of jives in within my next question. I'm just going to sort of ask these questions to sort of start the conversation rolling. If you had to sort of explain the aim of your project, would you say it was to shed light on maybe voices that are less muted or less well understood or perhaps downplayed? Or is it to really rethink how the Reformation is understood? Or maybe it's both. How would you articulate that?
Well, I hope that people might consider both. So, and not just people on the margins, but also ideas on the margins. So, for example, the book reevaluates nominalism and late medieval nominalism. It relies on a great deal of really important scholarship that has generally not been incorporated into a general view of nominalism. What I argue there is that it's important to take a very narrow view of what nominalism actually refers to, that properly refers to. So properly, it refers to a specific position on the ontology of the things indicated by Aristotle's 10 categories. So quality, quantity, relation, so forth. And you know a strictly nominalistic, well, Occam's nominalism was basically a contracted view of that. He argued that the category of substance, the first category, the sort of the principal category, always has actual form, but at least two of the other categories, quantity and relation, never do. That was considered an extreme position, and it was indeed very controversial. Many of the people who get classed as nominalists don't actually embrace that position, or they qualify it in one way or another. And those who are classed as realists almost always also approach that position in various ways. So a lot of this is very nicely summarized in the work of Robert Pasnow. A lot of it reflects the contribution of Bill Courtney to the study of late medieval intellectual life, which is really very fundamental, and so many others who have pursued specialized studies on one or another particular intellectual. The better term for what we normally class as nominalism is terminism. And terminism refers to specifically a method, a dialectical method, very heavy on logic, and a tendency to promote the idea that your arguments should be creative. So if you're a student in a late medieval school, what really matters is that you master that technique and you apply it creatively to your sources. Not that you embrace one specific doctrine having to do with the categories and the ontological status of the categories. If we look at it that way, then there are a couple of things that come out. What's important about first of all, what's important about that scholastic milieu is the role of play, of intellectual play and experiment in thought. So that's something that comes to the fore. Another thing that comes to the fore is a specific history over debate over nominalism. Mm-hmm. So what's really clear particularly from the work of a guy named Teves, and I'm just blanking on his full name, blank Rutger Teves, huge study of the University of Cologne. Mm-hmm. What he clearly maps out is that and then other work on John Wycliffe. What's clearly emerged is that the controversy over nominalism is basically a creation of realists, of Wycliffeites in the early 15th century. And they're the ones who developed the category of nominalism as a problematic category, but their teachings are associated with a condemned heretic, John Wycliffe. Mm-hmm. And he's a censured theologian, and then condemned by the Council of Constance. So it's the realist position that's actually the unorthodox position. Hmm. And people who are defending, or who are classed by those realists or the Wycliffeites as nominalists, are actually people who perceive themselves as defenders of orthodoxy, the exact opposite of what we're supposed to assume about nominalism. And so there's a very specific etiology to that conflict. When you study that debate, when you look at the people who are supposed to represent the nominalist position, they don't have a singular view of the question of the reality of Aristotle's categories. But what they do is embrace a terminist method. And so part of that conflict becomes an issue of styles of theology. That's something that's there, but it's never actually clearly resolved. And if you look then in retrospect at Luther's own use of Occam and his nominalism, Luther makes these grandiose statements about Occam being his teacher and that sort of thing. There are a couple dozens of those in his works. There's one, and there's a famous passage where he describes himself as a member of the Occamic faction. He's actually, in almost every instance, he's criticizing Occam when he appeals to Occam. And what he's demonstrating is, very cleverly, is an actual use of this creative method. And the way he uses that is, I think, a beautiful illustration of this feature of the scholastic culture, its playfulness, and the peril of assuming that a specific doctrinal position is inherited from the medieval past and then shapes the Reformation.
Right, that it's not a sort of a straight line progression.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
That was a longer explanation.
No, that works really well, and it's really helpful for those who are hearing. What I'd like to do is now encourage people. You can ask a question in the text, or you can simply unmute if you want to ask or question or make a comment, whether about what Chris has been saying, or perhaps if you've seen the book already and questions about that or about his overall perspective. I think that would be really helpful. So I'll let you either unmute. I'll keep an eye on the top here and just see who wants to ask questions and find out more. And otherwise, use the chat. So while they're thinking, I'll just carry on. For quite a while, I mean, it's sort of probably died down a little bit now, the confessionalization thesis was very big in Reformation studies. Would you say that your overall argument then counters that thesis pretty significantly? I mean, how would you connect what you're doing with the approach that really said, well, no, what's going on in the Reformation is really confessionalization?
That's an interesting question. In this first book, Luther, Conflict in Christendom, I tried to find an organic way to describe the evolution of the conflict over Luther. And what I identified there were certain dimensions of engagement that I think can best be described as political, and not political in the sense that they belong to public debate, not necessarily in the sense that they belong to the principal power brokers of the society, although I don't know why we would, given the day we live in, why we would minimize the influence of principal power brokers in society. Some of those things included the condemnation of Luther, the papal process against Luther, which has a certain kind of structure and development. The whole attempt to classify what he does as heresy. Then the appeal to a general council, which Luther, of course, does, and then the Protestant estates, obviously, in the Holy Roman Empire, they also embrace that strategy. It becomes really quite important in their eventually, receiving a kind of de facto acceptance within the Holy Roman Empire. So the appeal to a general council, which kept Luther from, being prosecuted, basically. And then the role of the imperial actions against Luther, so debate within among the imperial estates, and then church property. So those four areas are what I think very formative of how the controversy takes shape and develops. So that's my sort of non-personal approach to the Reformation, looking at conflict as exerting a force in and of itself. In this book, it works a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things that you can't really deny is that confessional debate is really essential, and it has a huge influence on the shape of religion in Europe. So the physical places change, the sound of those places change. You can immediately recognize when you are in a Catholic church, a Lutheran church, or a Reformed church, for example. Those things become really clear in most places. What isn't so clear is how many places are uniformly belong to one confession. And then, of course, the other thing that a lot of social history has shown is that the assimilation of a confessional position and its culture can take a very long time in particular places. And often there's considerable resistance to the degree of discipline that the confession wants to impose. So we know all that. So you can't just say it's about confessionalization. If you're really interested in trying to understand the character of religion in early modern Europe. I'm a little vague about the difference between the Middle Ages and the early modern period, with apologies to this group. I'm really a medievalist who has intruded himself in the study of the Reformation. So the thing, you can't limit it to that. So how do you recognize that power in religious debate, and at the same time show its weaknesses? And that's where this idea of a third force would come into play.
Yeah, and it's something that you actually see more and more in our colleagues' study of Reformation. There's a number of colleagues who are studying what they essentially borderlands, and borderlands can be a geographical issue, but it can also be an intellectual borderland. It can be a confessional borderland, and this sort of liminal space, right? Between groups where these compromises that you are highlighting may really find root. That makes it really quite fascinating. Yeah,
and it's and that I think a border is a beautiful illustration of this problem. A border is obviously distinguishes one side from another side, but it also defines a relationship between those sides. And that both end is really interesting and a really fascinating element of human experience and social experience.
So we have a question, Gregory Soderberg. Gregory, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So yeah, just kind of picking up on the influence of how they read the Bible in the medieval period. So Luther's early sermons are full of allegory. So chapter 9 in your book was very interesting. Could you talk more about what happened with allegory in the Reformation? Also, especially Calvin, you have him in there. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think I think I find numerous ways to say things that will offend somebody someplace along the way. So I have a problem with the way we usually talk about allegory, both in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. And the problem I have is, thank you for this question, Gregory. The problem that I have is that we often, especially when we're talking about the Bible and theology, that we assume allegory to be this very, very rigid kind of concept. It has rules and so forth, and I don't think it's like that at all. I think that there is a figurative quality to all human language, And I don't think that's invisible to people. You cannot take polemical statements about reckless allegorizing, for example, as equivalent to the way in which they actually use language or interpret language. So it's really important not to reduce what you assume about something like allegory and so many topics in theology to a polemical position, where scholar X is trying to say, I'm not a dirty Catholic, therefore I reject all this allegory. Oh, but I embrace typology. And the content of typology is identical with half of medieval allegory. And to say that the Ark of the Covenant is signifying some specific aspect of Christology is as allegorical as anything you can find in the Middle Ages. So we have to question some of the assumptions that are made. When a Protestant, let's say a 17th century Protestant, tries to describe what they're doing as typological rather than allegorical, we should ask questions. What's interesting is that they don't all do that. Some of them actually specifically appeal. So somebody I rely on quite a bit, who's extremely interesting and deserves a lot more attention than he's received, is Johann Jakob Rambach, a pietist, usually classified as a pietist theologian in the early 17th century. And he is deeply involved with the kind of scholarship that has given us such a much more differentiated and interesting view of pietism in recent scholarship. Well, he's a philologist par excellence. He writes several treatises on hermeneutics, huge treatises on hermeneutics, and very specifically defends the spiritual sense of Scripture against scholars who want to use philology to reduce the theological content of Scripture. And the big bad guy in all of this is one of the most pious people of the pious scholars of the 17th century. Oh goodness. I'm sorry, a 15th century name just popped in my head, but it's not getting out of the way. Is the author of this wonderful philological commentary, and also mostly known for his work on peace and international law. Goodness, I'm looking for a prompt here. So this is really embarrassing.
Grotius?
Pardon?
Grotius?
Hugo Grotius. Thank you, Rob. Bob and I sometimes do this for each other. The scholar I just mentioned is Johann Jakob Rambach. And so, there are numerous instances like this. And I think also, if you push it back, and I say this very reluctantly in this company, because there's some very prominent Calvin scholars in this audience, including you, Karen. I think it's also evident in some of Calvin's controversies, particularly in his conflict with, in this very strange conflict he had with Sebastian Castellio in Geneva, when Castellio was essentially forced to leave the city. So a clear interest that Calvin has in both what he understands to be obviously a literal interpretation of Scripture that has theological meaning, that is not restricted to a kind of theologically limiting historicism, I think is the major concern there. And I think some of that concern is also documented a bit on the other side in his conflict with so-called libertines.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you. We have one question in the chat from Alexis Van Zalen, who asks, can you say more about the connections and differences you see between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period? So this was in reference to your earlier comment. And she asked, why are you blurry about this? So the question, the borderlands there, that the differences and connections between the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Can you say a little more about that?
It's kind of, so there, That's not an easy question to answer. So I'll admit that. I think a lot of people on this call feel very strongly that that difference is very important. I think as a medievalist, there's so many things I look at in the Reformation that look to me and this is true of others. It's true of Volker Lepine. It's been true of Bernd Hamm, for example, that just look very medieval and somewhat different, but also quite medieval. So, for example, let's take the biblical scholarship. Now, it's clear that biblical scholarship in the 16th century, it tastes quite different than biblical scholarship in the 13th century. And yet, there are strong elements of continuity in a lot of that scholarship. So many of the commentaries, for example, Calvin's commentaries, give evidence of some genuine philological sophistication, but mostly they're interested in applying it to deriving theological meaning from the text. That's not really very different from what you find in 13th century scholastic commentaries or 14th or 15th century scholastic commentaries. The use of philology is limited. They know less than others, but it has some of the same basic features, including the application of rhetoric as a kind of literary analytical technique, as something that, this flourishing scholarship on Reformation biblical commentaries has laid bare in our generation. So that would be one example. Another example would be a theology. So it's kind of an old truism of particularly German church history, church history written in Germany since the Luther Renaissance in the early 20th century, that Luther's theology, his theological writing, is quite different than what you find in almost any other theologian of the second half of the 16th century, so in the generation after Luther, or the two generations after Luther. And what they've often observed is that, that Protestant theology seems to regress into this kind of pre-Reformation-like scholasticism. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a lot of scholarship, including, Calvin Seminary's Richard Muller, who was my first teacher of the Reformation, actually, at Fuller Theological Seminary, very, very young Richard Muller. One of the things that's become really clear is that, for one, that intellectual productivity is very sophisticated. It is true and clear that they rely very heavily on late medieval debates. And what is also clear is that if you just take the most famous Protestant theologians, let's say Luther and Calvin, as representative of the entire intellectual movement, yeah, sure, you can say, well, this is clearly a very anti-scholastic movement. It's qualitatively utterly different from late medieval theology. And then when you're looking at late medieval theology, you're thinking of commentaries on Peter Lombard's sentences. You're ignoring the Bible commentaries, which were still produced throughout the 14th and 15th centuries as a regular part of the formation of a theologian. And you're taking a very selective view. And so if you broaden that view, if you open up the frame, if you start including more late medieval literature, more 16th century theologians, the differences do not look that profound. They often look like, as Bernd Hamm, I think, very cleverly described it, as an intensification of trends that existed later, rather than a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Alexis has replied, that makes sense. Thanks. I'm a music historian, so not as attuned to theological development, but it's interesting to hear about. Thank you. So that's good. That seemed to have answered that series of questions. I'm wondering, a lot of what you had to say in terms of the narrative or the direction of your study was oriented around the concept of compromises. Can you say a little more what you mean by compromises in the context of the Reformation? Because I think understanding that would probably clarify a little more the direction of your study.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, essentially what I mean are compromises of a strict ideological position.
Mhm.
So, a willing, and I think this is something that you find ordinary people doing and others, and intellectuals. So, for example, if you take, take the example of John Calvin, and I think others may have a different view. Others in this meeting may have a different view of this, and I'd be happy to hear, why they find this problematic. So, that would be interesting. But Calvin, early in the Institutes, he makes a few statements of divine being that are really quite expansive and extraordinary. And when he describes, for example, human beings as subsisting in divine being, as a subsistence of divine substance, essentially. So that's a really quite remarkable claim. As he unfolds it in the Institutes and in other of his writings, that becomes a very important foundation for his notion of providence. So he has a very expansive view of divine providence, and describes it, often in quite extreme terms. And as we know, in the case of Jerome Bolsec, he really doesn't hesitate in describing it in extreme terms, and he doesn't mind interrupting people's lives in quite unkind way if they don't agree. So, part of that has to do with his notion of human humility and how a human being is related to the divine, how objecting to this comprehensive view of divine providence is kind of an erection of setting yourself up in opposition to God's actual being. You're not acknowledging some fundamental quality of existence. If you think through that position metaphysically, you will have to ask some hard questions, good scholastic questions, like, well, what is it that distinguishes an individual soul from divine spirit? These are problems that, are very familiar to us in the course of the Reformation, because, it comes up in the polemic against the libertines in the 1540s. It comes up with Servetus, with his rather, remarkable but not unique view that divine spirit is associated with air, and people actually ingest that air and it's in your body, which is kind of a really interesting idea. So you could say that Calvin is kind of teetering on the edge of a panentheism at the least, or perhaps just, I'm not even sure, what is it that distinguishes panentheism from pantheism? To say God is in everything or is everything doesn't seem like a terribly fine distinction to me. But and the same with if you do believe that everything that actually occurs is something that occurs with divine permission. And what exactly is the distinction between divine permission and divine action? Which, as some of you know, was actually a pretty hot question in the later 16th century among both Protestant and Catholic theologians. So, that's an example of a position that Calvin is clearly not pantheistic. He clearly polemicizes very strongly against it. And yet his actual proximity to the idea seems quite close. And I think that, the notion of compromise could apply here too. That Calvin is actually compromising a metaphysical logic, a logic based in metaphysics, partly because he believes that his use of scripture, the way he reads scripture, prevents it. So he can simply say, I know by my clear reading of scripture that God is not the same as all other entities. Therefore, this becomes a crucial distinction, whether or not it's consistent with a metaphysical position. So let's say a notion of world soul, or Servetus's notion, or Marguerite's d'Angoulême's mysticism, or whatever.
Right. Good. Thank you. Other questions, other things people want to ask? I've kind of been taking the lead here, but I'm sure there are other people who want to ask things. or share their own insights. Just going up and down the row here. Unmute if you have something you want to inquire about or share. All right, looks like we've got most everyone covered right this minute. So in your section on Calvin, you highlighted the importance of the figurative reading of Scripture for Calvin, and I think it was kind of an interesting distinction that you were making there. Are you willing to say a little more about that in terms of what you had in mind when you were talking about Calvin's perhaps figurative use of Scripture, which might not be the first thing people think of when they're thinking of Calvin's reading of Scripture?
Well, there are others who've talked about this problem in Calvin's commentaries, where he does embrace particularly Christological interpretations of Old Testament texts or the history of Israel, and those are well known. And I guess the basic point that I want to make is that there's nothing about that it's arbitrary to distinguish that from allegory. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, just something that isn't really very controversial. If you read Calvin's commentaries, you find it all over the place. So that's really clear. Mm-hmm. The more interesting issue is, where he shows anxiety, a recognition of the historicizing potential of philological exegesis and anxiety over that. And that's where I think the controversy over Castellio, where as Calvin played a really crucial role in the consistory's opposition to Castellio's appointment to a parish. Mm-hmm. And that became a lifelong animosity shared by both. So what's clear there is that it seems to me is that he really is kind of worried about this idea that you can take a book of the Bible, like the Song of Songs, and you can actually remove it or deny its canonicity. It's not entirely clear that Castellio actually did that. It is very clear that the consistory accused him of doing that, and that Calvin individually accused him of doing that. So what's that all about? Well, I think it's really taking that approach that I've suggested before, where, as you point out, compromise is really important. It's important to consider that strong polemical positions can, in fact, be an expression of anxiety that arises from close proximity to a position as well as resistance to it. Mm-hmm. So, he knows the potential of an exegetical method to undermine the theological conclusions associated with the Bible. And he wants to exclude that possibility.
Because of the dangers that might arise from that.
The dangers that might arise from that. And that's something that in the second to last chapter, I tried to develop on the example of numerous cases of Protestant and Catholic theologians approaching that strictly historicizing view, which has been so emphasized by so many historians and Bible scholars, and the resistance to that historicizing view.
And I think part of it's to do with the conflict over authority and who gets to be the authoritative interpreter. I mean, that's such a big issue in the Reformation.
Exactly. Yeah.
A lot of the work that I've done has been on the training of pastors. And one of the key thing is who gets to train the pastor and who gets to train the interpreters of Scripture, and what track will they take? Because that has a lot to do. It's never unmediated Scripture. It's always Scripture interpreted by someone, and who gets to do the interpreting is a fundamental issue.
It's always Scripture. Yeah, that's so. And your work and Amy Nelson Burnett's work, has been so important in helping us understand that this that these professional lives, the professional lives that these theologians are leading, they're entangled with all sorts of things. They're entangled with the city's politics. They're entangled with their own ambitions. They're entangled with the network, and all of that has to affect the way we think about ideas. That's really what I'm
absolutely 100%. All right, anyone else who still has something they wanted to add or ask or contribute? I'm going to go around again just to make sure I don't miss anybody. This is your chance. All right, it looks like everyone had enjoyed this mightily. So what we're going to do at this point is thank you, Chris, very much for your time. I think it's been a good opportunity for us to hear about a recent publication. I hope those of you who haven't yet had a chance to find his book get a chance to find it and read it. I think it's got a lot of really fascinating insights that can really help us as we reflect on the Reformation and its significance. So we wish you well for all your various projects. And yes, I hope there's some good reviews coming out of your book and a good audience that reaches these ideas. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope so too.
Everybody else, as we go forward, our next Zoom Reformation Conversations will be on April the 12th. That's a Wednesday. It will be at 11 a.m., not at 1 p.m., but at 11 a.m. start, because our presenter, Sukyu Chan, is in Scotland. And for her, the time change is such that it would be much easier if we do an 11 a.m. start, which is 4 p.m. in Scotland at the time. She'll be talking about her recent book on Calvin and Divine Providence. That will be April 12 at 11 a.m. And the invitation to join this Zoom webinar will come out to you shortly. Meanwhile, thank you all extremely very much. Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.